September 1, 1914. Exactly 1 p.m., a female passenger pigeon named Martha takes her final breath, completely alone in a cage at the Cincinnati Zoo.
1 o'clock in the afternoon. At that exact hour, an entire species literally blinked out of existence. Martha was the absolute last of her kind. She had actually outlived the very last confirmed male passenger pigeon, a bird named George, by 4 lonely years.
3 to 5 billion. Let's move to and see how this builds, because to truly grasp the tragedy of that single bird in a cage, we have to flash back to the early 19th century. Back then, her species was, without a doubt, the most numerous bird in North America. In fact, many ornithologists believe the passenger pigeon was very possibly the most numerous bird species to ever exist anywhere on Earth. Their population hovered right around 3 to 5 billion.
5 billion. I mean, just let that massive number sit there for a second. It's almost unfathomable. To put that into perspective, the naturalist Alexander Wilson was standing in Kentucky in the early 1800s, and he watched a single flock pass overhead. He calculated that this one solitary flock stretched nearly a mile wide and hundreds of miles long. It contained over 2 billion birds, and it took several hours just to pass over his head.
Decades later, the famous painter and ornithologist John James Audubon stood under a similar flock in Kentucky. His account is incredibly visceral. He said they obscured the sky as if by an eclipse. The sheer volume of bodies blotted out the noonday sun, dropping the entire landscape into this weird false twilight. And here's a detail that totally flips how we think about birds: the sound. When we think of birds, we usually think of chirping, right? Well, 1 billion passenger pigeons didn't chirp. The continuous beating of that many wings created a deafening, unbroken roar that Audubon described as sounding exactly like distant thunder. It was a storm of flesh and feathers that roared continuously over his head for 3 straight days.
And when it came time to breed, they absolutely did not spread out. They packed together into nesting colonies that honestly defy logic. Take the 1871 Wisconsin nesting site. It covered 850 square miles and held well over 100 million birds. They were so intensely packed into these eastern hardwood forests that dozens of nests weighed down individual trees. The combined sheer physical weight of these birds was so immensely heavy that it routinely snapped massive branches and literally toppled mature trees right to the very ground.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is predator satiation. That's an evolutionary survival strategy where prey group in such sheer, overwhelming numbers that local predators cannot possibly make a dent in the population. There's a deep biological irony here. Packing tightly together like that wasn't an accident. It was an incredibly successful survival tactic. For millennia, this strategy made them virtually invincible. Local hawks, owls, and mammals could gorge themselves day and night, but they simply could not mathematically make a dent in a colony of 100 million birds. The pigeon's absolute greatest defense was its own sheer, overwhelming abundance.
The telegraph and train. But that evolutionary armor, forged over immense spans of time to defeat hawks and owls, suddenly ran headfirst into an entirely new kind of predator. We're pivoting away from a story about nature and into a tale of industrial logistics.
Natural limits versus industrial reach. On one side, hawks and owls. On the other, railroads, telegraphs, and repeating shotguns. The tragedy here is that the species collided catastrophically with industrial-era humans. And here's a perspective shift you might not see coming. The very technology that connected the modern world became the ultimate weapon of mass extinction. Because when a massive nesting colony formed, the telegraph allowed spotters to broadcast its exact location instantly across the country. Commercial hunters, reading these real-time updates, would pack onto trains and arrive at the forest within days, armed to the teeth with repeating shotguns.
Okay, let's dive into this. This commercial slaughter absolutely was not local hunting. It was a ruthless, nationwide extraction industry. They supplied cheap meat to restaurants all across the eastern United States. A single professional hunter could ship hundreds of thousands of birds to market in just one season. They captured them using huge nets, long poles, and even by lighting sulfur fires under the trees to suffocate them. Young squabs, fat and completely flightless, were just knocked or smoked right out of the canopy in unimaginable numbers. And if that wasn't enough, the eastern hardwood forests were being systematically cleared for agriculture, completely destroying the seasonal beech and oak nut crops the birds desperately depended on to survive. They were literally being starved and slaughtered at the exact same time.
And this brilliantly illustrates the dizzying, terrifying speed of their free fall. The 1870s saw the commercial hunting peak. Just a decade later, the 1880s marked the absolute last wild colonies. By the 1890s, seeing a wild passenger pigeon was such an extreme anomaly that rare sightings were actually reported in the local news. Naturalists who grew up watching sky-darkening flocks were totally stunned. A limitless population, billions of birds that shaped the very geography of the continent, simply vanished within a single human lifetime.
No birds at all. The skies fell entirely silent. The billions became millions, the millions became thousands, and those thousands abruptly evaporated into isolated, terrified individuals scattered across a radically changed landscape.
Ohio, 1900. Felled by a boy who did not realize what he was holding. The final land in the wild came with a whisper, not a roar. The tragic irony is that the last confirmed wild passenger pigeon was shot by a young boy in Ohio. He wasn't a commercial hunter or a naturalist. He couldn't have possibly known what he had just killed. He picked the bird up off the ground, entirely unaware that he was holding the absolute last wild fragment of a 3-day thunderstorm.
Captive populations dwindled. The species was now just a ghost in the wild. It only survived in a small number of zoological collections and aviaries scattered around the country. As the years ticked by into the early 20th century, these isolated birds just slowly died off. They completely refused to breed, producing 0 offspring, eventually leaving only Martha alone in her cage.
300 pounds of ice. When Martha's heart finally stopped at 1 p.m. on that September afternoon in 1914, there was no grand ceremony. Her small, stiff body was simply gathered up, packed deep into the center of a 300-pound block of solid ice, and loaded onto a train headed for the Smithsonian Institution.